Dear friends of the Hellenic Circle, today we have the honor and pleasure to have with us Professor Roderick Beaton to discuss certain aspects of the Greek Revolution of 1821 on the basis of his recent book, The Greek Revolution of 1821 and its Global Signification. Here it is. And also of his previous publications. Roderick Beaton grew up in Edinburgh and studied English literature at Cambridge before specializing in modern Greek studies. For 30 years until his retirement, he held the Koraes Chair of Modern Greek and Byzantine History, Language and Literature at King's College London and is now emeritus. Roderick is the author of several books, all of them connected to Greece and the Greek-speaking world. He won several awards. He is a Fellow of the British Academy, a Fellow of King's College, and Commander of the Order of Honor of the Hellenic Republic. He is a member of the Committee Greece 2021, charged by the Greek government with overseeing events commemorating the 200th anniversary of the start of the Greek Revolution in 1821. His latest book is The Greeks, a Global History, published in the USA and the UK in autumn 2021. Dear Professor Beaton, welcome. I wish to thank you very much indeed for accepting to speak to us on this subject.
Thank you, it's my pleasure. KYKLOS Afrika.
Καλώς ήρθατε. Your recent book, published in English and in Greek, discusses the Greek Revolution of 1821, the creation of the modern Greek state and its global significance. To start this discussion with you, I would like to ask you about the definition of a revolution. What is, in your opinion, the principal element that makes the Greek uprising a revolution and not just a struggle for political autonomy? Generally speaking, what is for you the common element of all sorts of revolutions you mention in the introduction of your book, in the social, economic, political, and art fields? And what is the interaction amongst all these types of revolution? For instance, the Philhellenes, most of Philhellenes at the time were intellectuals and artists belonging to the movement of Romanticism, which is considered as a non-violent revolution. And these Philhellenes had an impact on the provision of support from abroad to the revolution. Romantics on one hand, warriors on the other. Isn't there an internal contradiction?
Well, thank you. That's quite a series of questions all in one. And I think you start off with a very important question, which I must admit I did not really address in my little book, which is, actually, what do you mean by a revolution? What makes it a revolution? And I suppose my sort of prohiro off the cuff answer to you would be a revolution is a series of actions that result or are aimed at resulting in a radical change in the system of government for a people, a community, a geographical area. In other words, let's stay within the area of Greece. The revolt or rebellion by Ali Pasha that began in 1820 was a rebellion or a revolt, but not a revolution. Because if Ali Pasha had succeeded, his aim, like many other local leaders called Ayan within the Ottoman system, was simply to replace the Sultan's rule within his own geographical area with rule by himself. Had he succeeded, the area of Greece, or Yanina, would still have been part of the Ottoman Empire. And even if it became independent of the Ottoman Empire, it would still have been ruled in exactly the same way. The Greek Revolution was different because right from the start, it aimed to change the entire status of the Greek people. They would no longer be Rayadis, they would no longer be the subject people of the Ottoman Islamic Empire. They would be self-governing. There was lots still to be decided about what form that self-government would take. But the revolution, in intention and in result, it changed the nature of the Ottoman Empire itself, which became slightly smaller as a result, but it created a completely different kind of government for the Greeks living in that part of the Balkans and the Aegean where they lived. It was a revolution in the same sense that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were, but different therefore from a local revolt. It wasn't a question of a leader seeking to promote his own self-interest. It was a radical change. And of course, the Greek Revolution was the first in the old world of Europe to succeed in that. The other part of your question was about how it relates to Romanticism. And indeed, the Romantic Revolution, with or without inverted commas, is part, or relates to the so-called Age of Revolutions of the first part of the 19th century. It's sometimes paired with another non-violent revolution, namely the Industrial Revolution, which again changed everything about the social arrangements and many of the aspects of governance throughout the developed world. And you were asking me, are the architects of the Greek Revolution, the leaders of the Greek Revolution, are they part of that Romantic movement? Are they Romantic warriors? And you were suggesting there's perhaps an internal contradiction between a violent revolution with the aim of achieving political self-determination and the non-violent revolution of Romanticism, which is a change in the whole way in which people think. And my answer, I suppose, is contradiction or not, both of these things are in there. They're part of the mix that is the Greek Revolution. And in terms of ideology, the Greek Revolution, perhaps the same can be said of the French, actually. It exists exactly on the moment of change, the cusp, or the krisikambi, as you would say in Greek, between the neoclassical Enlightenment before and the dominance of Romanticism after. And I think it's fair to say that both of these intellectual trends, or both of these ideologies, feed into the Greek Revolution. And indeed, they probably jostle for position during it. Add yet another complication. Most of those who were fighting on the ground in Greece, and some of their foreign supporters, were inspired by religion. For most of the ordinary people who fought and who survived, took part in the revolution, the struggle was not about either the Enlightenment or Romanticism. They hardly knew of these things. It was often not primarily even the ancient heritage. It was their Orthodox Church, the rituals, the beliefs, the practices, the communities that were built around the Orthodox Church, often at a very local level. So it was also, at the same time, it was a war inspired by the Enlightenment, but it was also a religious war, which belongs in a way to a completely different, almost to a different historical period. That's quite a long answer, but in extenuation, it was quite a complex question.
Thank you very much. Vassilis?
Yes, it's true. So, okay, first of all, let me tell you, it's really a pleasure and honor, as Maria said, to have you with us this evening in this discussion about given the anniversary of the revolution and about your books. So I move from the book that Maria mentioned, I moved to your other book about Greece, Biography of a Modern Nation. In this book, I saw this, I've read this passage that, to my opinion, gives food for thought, and it's the following. Samuel Huntington in his influential book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remarking of the World Order, noted the paradox. Greece is not part of Western civilization, but it was the home of classical civilization, which was an important source of Western civilization. In fact, Greece is part of Western civilization for the very simple reason that over the last 200 years, Greeks have determined that it should be. But as the double inheritance from its ancestors shows, Greece does not belong only to the West. It belongs also to the East. And this is part of the same duality, and it's not reducible to a single proposition. It is not either or, East or West, but both East and West. So my question is the following. 200 years later, this dualism seems to be reflecting a unique trait of the national identity for Greeks. To what extent can we blame, if you like, on this dualism, the bright or the dark moments of the revolution? How the Greek Revolution as a historical phenomenon is reflecting the dualism of the Greek identity?
Well, I think with that question, you really go to the heart of, I suppose, both books, which is really the creation of a specifically modern Greek identity, which was crucially and violently formed during the years of the revolution, building on years of build-up to that through the Greek Enlightenment and influences from abroad. But it was fundamentally the Greek Revolution, I believe, that established not Greek identity, because Greeks had had an identity for more than 3,000 years, but that forged the specifically modern identity, which really revolves around the creation of the nation state. And it's worth reflecting that that process, we tend to think of it as being telescoped into the 10 years of the 1820s and the revolution. But if you think about it, the majority of Greeks, Greek speakers, Greek Orthodox, throughout the 19th century, live actually outside the Greek state. And that change in the way of thinking that really makes Athens the capital of the Greek world, and Greek identity, wherever Greeks are living, focused upon the Greek state, was quite gradually formed throughout the first century after the revolution, and tragically confirmed and consolidated in the Asia Minor catastrophe of 1922, because it was the failure, the eventual failure of the megali there, the great idea of expanding the state to encompass all of the Greek nation. It was the failure of that really forced the widespread Greek nation and the smaller Greek state really to collapse into one another. And even then, it's not the end of the story, because I think I'm talking to people who are largely made up of Greeks who live in other parts of Europe outside Greece. And as you don't need me to tell you, there are lively Greek communities established and the Greek language is spoken on every one of the world's inhabited continents. So there remains today a very active and lively Greek diaspora right across the world. That's indeed one of the reasons why I gave the title to my most recent book of A Global History, because I wanted to highlight precisely the global role that Greeks have played right throughout their long recorded history. But to come back to your question, this dichotomy between East and West, to begin with, and which is forged during the revolution, this is probably more an issue for the Greek state than for the more widely diffused Greek nation. And if you think of a nation that is actually spread right across the world, it almost literally is a contradiction in terms to think of belonging to the East or the West. If you're, if you're in Sydney or Melbourne in Australia, or in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, or in San Francisco or New York, or in South America, that dichotomy between East and West seems a rather local European affair. But in terms of establishing the identity for the Greek state through the revolution, it was crucial. It was a vital part of establishing that identity, because the Greek state emerged as part of the Ottoman Empire, which in relation to Europe is synonymous with the East. But it did so by identifying, particularly at elite levels, by identifying with the whole cultural tradition and history of Europe, which is broadly West, although it's worth reflecting that Europe at that time also includes Orthodox Russia. So even within Europe, there's an Eastern Orthodox component and a Western the Western, let's say, the world of the Enlightenment. So the newly emerging Greek state is struggling to identify itself, to find a place for itself, not only in relation to the long history of Hellenism, but also in relation to the wider geographical context in which it has to, to fight to carve out its existence. On the one hand, looking west and north to the Catholic, Protestant, Enlightenment, secular Europe. On the other, looking north to the rest of the other Orthodox Balkans, and particularly to Russia, the Orthodox power, and of course, in relation to the much greater power to the east of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm not sure whether it truly answers your question or not, but I think it is one of the remarkable achievements of the Greek Revolution and of the leaders and the architects of the Greek state at the beginning, but also afterwards, to make that tiny nation state viable, to make it able to survive surrounded by these much larger geopolitical, military and cultural forces. And through 200 years, the Greek state has succeeded in doing that. It certainly had its tragedies as well as its triumphs, and I mentioned the Asia Minor catastrophe, which was indeed literally that, a catastrophe. But if you think of the map of Europe as it was 200 years ago, look what happened to the Imperial Russia, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, all of them disbanded at the end of the First World War. Think of states like the infamous German Reich of the interwar period and the Second World War, or shorter-lived states like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Greece has, perhaps modestly, but practically and to its own advantage, surely, expanded its boundaries, it's consolidated its democratic credentials. It has its respected place today within the European Union, and Greeks worldwide are a recognized presence on the world stage. And let's not forget, talking of the world stage, those inspired those Greek entrepreneurs, the traders, the owners of ships, beginning with the people in islands like Hydra and Spetses in Psara, but continuing to those worldwide empires, literally empires, of people like Aristoteles, Onassis, Stavros Niarchos, and think also of the remarkable gifts that these entrepreneurs have given through their global efforts to the Greek state, but also keeping hands-off distance from the Greek state. I think the Onassis Foundation has its headquarters in Liechtenstein, the capital of this worldwide Greek enterprise has always been separate from that of the Greek state. And probably they're about as rich, some of those maritime empires, as the state itself.
I see. So the dualism is an advantage in the end for surviving, let's say. Keep going.
Well, actually, I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but that's a good way of putting it. Why not? It could have been a threat, but those enterprising Greeks in a different way found ways of turning it to their advantage. Yes, why not?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now a question coming from Costis.
Yes, thank you, Maria. Professor Beaton, thank you for being with us today. It's a great pleasure to meet you even remotely. My question is somehow related to the previous one. In the Greek biography of a modern nation, you look at the development of Greek national identity through history, and by treating modern Greece as a biographical subject, a living entity in its own right, you introduce a new approach to Greek historiography. You had already looked at that matter from a different perspective in one of your previous books concerning the concept of nation in Greek literature and the active role of literary texts in the formation of national identity, starting from the 12th century, going up to Empiricus and Rea Galanaki. In your opinion, when does the development of the Greek national identity start? How far back in history shall we go to find the emergence of Greek national consciousness? And also, which is the most important element in the Greek national identity, language or religion? And finally, do you believe that Anderson's theory of imagined communities can properly be applied to the case of Greece? Thank you.
Okay, you're right. I've changed my mind, changed perspective, certainly, from different stages, I think, of my academic career. There was a stage when, I wrote a book about what I call the medieval Greek romance, or mythistoria of Byzantium from the 12th to the 15th century. And I was already, I was very much focused on literature at that time, but I was already trying to feel my way towards, or grappling with, the relation between literary expression, particularly through a spoken language, and the consciousness or identity of belonging to a national community that is perhaps related to that. So I think I was working really in quite long established assumptions, at least in the English-speaking world, which relate the creation of a national culture to the establishment of a national language. And as you know, people talk about the French medieval romance, which collectively establishes French as a literary language, Dante Alighieri in Italian in the 14th century, Cervantes in Spain in the 17th century, Geoffrey Chaucer in English again in the 14th century. It's when the vernacular emerges into literary formal expression that's traditionally been associated with the development of what later becomes known as a national consciousness. And I did actually experiment with, I think in some ways, in some senses, I think you can justify this. I suggested in that early book that actually the Byzantines of the 12th century, I think what I said was, had a national consciousness, or something akin to a modern national consciousness, foisted on them rather by accident, because the frontiers of Byzantium were shrinking at that time. And it really became the case that Byzantines, more than previously, were really concentrated on the old heartlands where Greek had always been the spoken language. And I was wondering, well, is that maybe the beginning of a modern Greek national consciousness? It's certainly the historical moment when we get the modern form of Greek emerging into literary expression in poems like the Ptochoprodromika, the Anisakritis, the epic poem, and then later you have the wonderful poetic inventions of Crete under the Venetians, or works like the Chronicon de Moreos, the Chronicle of the Morea of the 14th century in the Peloponnese. But when I wrote the biography of the modern nation, I was approaching the history of the Greeks in, I suppose, a more rigorously historical perspective. And I tried to explain in the introduction to that book that I was considering different ways of defining the nation, and for the purposes of that book, opted on quite a narrow definition, which was almost a circular definition. Is one favored by many theorists of nations and nationalism in the English-speaking world, namely that nations are a product of the 18th century and the Enlightenment. And it was in that narrower sense that I wanted to look at the creation of the modern Greek state in the context of the Age of Revolutions, rather than the longer development of the Greek language as a means of literary expression.
So my question takes its origin in the famous dispute over the name of Macedonia. By the way, I like very much a term that I noticed in your book, because you're writing on this issue as well. You wrote the internationally minded Greek commentators. So I guess the antonym in English should be the nationally minded, if I may. For many people, the distinction internationally minded, nationally minded, can imply that the internationally minded are less patriotically minded than their counterparts. Though I think that my opinion is that the internationally minded are those who just see the interests of Greece under a far more pragmatic perspective. What does pragmatic mean, in my opinion? Without resorting to the ancestral voices, another nice term in your book. But perhaps, which I believe, we are just facing again the famous dualism, already mentioned by Vassilis, I think, which is a Greek calamity since several centuries. Sticks to unsubstantiated beliefs of various content, be it ethnic, political, religious. And while I was rereading my question, I would like to make a bet, not with you, but generally. If we make a gallop among the internationally minded and the nationally minded, I'm sure that among the internationally, those people who are vaccinated are much more, many more. This is my, because those who don't get vaccinated, it's like an ancestral voice saying, don't touch my body, my religion, I don't trust you. So anyway, that was a digression that came into my mind at this moment. There's nothing to do with your book and the discussion. So I would just like to hear your opinion on this dualism. And well, the question is finally, are they internationally minded less patriotic? Less of patriots? What is the problem with them? Or is the problem with the others, the nationally minded? That's all.
Well, exactly. I mean, as you say, it's a dichotomy between looking outwards, looking to international relations, looking to diplomacy on the one hand, and on the other, a focus on the national, on the integrity, perhaps slightly defensive, but certainly a sense of defending that which belongs to us, which in this case is the Greeks. It is the name of, and of course it is the name of Macedonia. It was a particularly, I mean, I suppose because I live outside Greece, I was particularly aware of the, if you like, the international dimensions of that, of the Macedonikor, as they call it, the Neo-Macedonikor, the dispute over the name of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And what struck me was that almost no one I talked to about this or read on it who wasn't Greek could really understand what all the fuss was about. You know, okay, they want to call it Macedonia, so what? You know, you have the province of Macedonia, they have a state called Macedonia. You know, we have Great Britain, but there's a part of France called Bretagne, which is the same name. There's Northern Ireland, there's Ireland. You know, there are various, you know, so it's not unique that a name has different significance for different countries, different places. Whereas for almost all my Greek friends and the Greek media, you know, with varying degrees, you know, the fact that a neighboring country was appropriating the name and also some national symbol, taking as its own national symbols, terms and symbolisms and icons that are, you know, are understood to be part of Greek history. And I mean, in some ways, if you look at it from a distance, both in geography and in history, it's a kind of non-issue, because, you know, whoever the Slavo-Macedones or the people of today's North Macedonia historically are, or however they choose to define themselves today, nobody doubts that the Slav language that they speak first entered the Balkans in the 5th and 6th century CE, so about 1,000 years after the time of Philip II and Alexander the Great. Nobody's arguing that that Alexander the Great was a Yugoslav, put it that way, but that's obviously not the way it was felt. That it's felt in Greece, and I think it's indicative of the way in which the Greek state and the Greek nation has constantly had to fight to defend its own existence through the centuries. That this is what I would call, if you like, the nationally minded view of the Makedoniko, that anything that encroaches on you know, what are called in Greek ethnika zidimata, national questions, is potentially a threat. And I mean, for what it's worth, I tried to be as even-handed as I could in the book, because I certainly didn't want to take sides on an issue that did quite seriously divide Greek society for 20 years. But the way I saw it is that it was a dispute, an internal Greek dispute. Do we argue? Do we negotiate our way out of this? Do we argue our way out of this? Do we seek to make allies abroad? Do we seek to talk to these people in North Macedonia, as it's now called? You know, given that we, the Greeks, economically had an enormous advantage over that fledgling state in the 1990s, was a soft power that Greece could have used to influence some of the belligerent rhetoric that was coming out of that country at the time? Or, you know, do we fall back on the kind of slogans of Eleftheria is Anatos, you know, I Macedonia in Elliniki? Well, because nobody was really saying that it wasn't. It was just that people who were not Greek were also wanting to use that name for reasons which are also part of their own history. And I mean, to go back to what I think is the essence of your question, I do see that dichotomy between the internationalist, the diplomatists, the openness, the working through intermediaries and through dialogue with others. On the one hand, I see that in opposition to an equally strong trait within Greek policy, perhaps dare I say Greek national character, that came out during the revolution. The sense of Patakia, that, you know, the ideology of the kleftiko traugouthi, the songs of the klefts as brigands and freedom fighters, where freedom is an absolute, it's non-negotiable, and it's got nothing to do with political theories or democracy. It's just the charisma of the local leader and a kind of ideal of a local self-sufficiency. And I'm not really trying to make any statement about national stereotyping, and I try to avoid anything of the sort. But I do believe that the Greek Revolution brought those two tendencies or directions for the first time into conflict and competition. And that competition, and sometimes even conflict between them, has resurfaced continually throughout the 200 years of the history of the Greek state. Think of, in the revolution, there are literary civil wars. And on the one side, you have the politicians, such as Mavrokordatos. On the other, you have the warlords, such as Kolokotronis and Routsos Karaiskakis, and so on. Go forward to the late 19th century, you have the parliamentary competition between Charelos Trikoupis and Theodoros Dilianis. Go on a generation, you have violence once again, the ethnikos dichasmos. The terms have changed, but the bitterness of the conflict has not. You have the whole interwar period, Venizelos and anti-Venizelists. You have the Second World War, occupation, violence once again, a complete split in Greek society. Again, the outward terms, communist versus capitalist or anti-communist, but the fundamentals, that fundamental dichotomy perhaps is still there in a different form. The self-sufficiency of the capitanias on the mountains versus the government in exile, and negotiations with some loss of sovereignty as a result, it has to be said, that went with working with the great powers. And, well, perhaps most recently, what about the Greek Spring, so called by some of 2015? You've got Alexis Tsipras and Yanis Varoufakis threatening to go it alone, leave the Eurozone, become, follow the Patakia of the old clefts. Or you have the Triton Mnemonio. Well, we know how that one ended.
So do you think that these civil wars and the dichasmi in Greece during the revolution and afterwards, were they the reason or the pretext for more foreigners' intervention?
Were they the pretext for foreign intervention, or were they perhaps caused by foreign intervention? I think both. Because one of the, I remember there's a famous statement by Kolokotronis when he was approached on behalf of Lord Byron. And Kolokotronis actually said he didn't think it was a good idea for the Greeks to accept loans from London, because if the English lend lots of money to Greece, they'll actually want to exercise power in Greece. And, well, I'm a Brit, but I can't put my hand on my heart and say, well, the British didn't interfere in Greek politics. They did. Those, Mavrokordatos, the leader of the so-called English party, was the one who did most, who wanted to place Greece under the protection of Great Britain. And in the end, his party was successful in drawing the great powers into the Greek Revolution. It was that initiative that brought the naval task force to the Eastern Mediterranean, that resulted in the Battle of Navarino. It was a decisive event in the Greek Revolution. But of course, I think Mavrokordatos was entirely, and Kapodistrias too afterwards, they were quite clear-eyed that the downside of involving the international dimension was always going to be some loss of sovereignty, some involvement of these great powers. The very fact that the great powers were prepared to guarantee the independence of Greece, after all, in hard-headed geopolitics, what is often called realpolitik, there was always going to be some trade-off for that. And you see that at many infamous occasions during the 19th century, when the great powers actually intervened physically in Greece. They had declared by treaty in 1830 that Greece would enjoy all the rights of full independence. But that independence wasn't so full in 1849, when the British Prime Minister Palmerston sent the Royal Navy to blockade Piraeus in the so-called Patakia. It wasn't full independence when Piraeus was blockaded during the Crimean War. And for 3 years, Greece was blockaded by Britain and France and basically held in a state of economic bankruptcy to prevent Greece joining in alliance with Russia in the Crimean War. And even in the 20th century, during the time of the Ethnikos Dichotomy, the British and French, again, with Italian support this time, actually landed troops in Phaleron and Athens in 1916 in order to force Greece to join their side in the First World War. And they actually had the effrontery, the audacity to claim that this was a right given to the guarantor powers who had guaranteed Greek independence by the Treaty of 1832. That is actually not in the Treaty of 1832. They did not have that right, but they could claim it as late as that. So what am I saying? There is, the dichotomy is based on it goes back to that there are those within Greece who are prepared to make that concession in order to get to win the support of international organizations. And that's most evident today, of course, in Greece's membership of the European Union. For the majority of Greeks, as I understand it, certainly for all Greek governments, so far, the concession of sovereignty of being part of the supranational union is worth making for the solidarity of that union in face of threats to territorial integrity and various other forms from outside the union, most notably, of course, from Turkey. But the alternative mentality, the alternative way of thinking, we don't want those foreigners interfering. Let's drop out of the Eurozone. We can do it all by ourselves. And, well, I mean, that was part of how the Greeks did win their independence in the 1820s. So I don't want to come in as a foreigner and say Greeks can't do it by themselves. But as a foreigner, I'm bound to say that I'm glad that the internationalist view has prevailed in at least the public sphere in Greece until now, and I hope it will continue to do. But I do recognize and respect the alternative, which after all is very similar to the view that prevailed quite recently in my own country, when by a very narrow margin, we voted to leave the European Union. And we have a government that feels bound to fulfill in a very extreme form that alleged popular mandate. Let's not suggest for a moment that belief in absolute national self-sufficiency is something that belongs to the Greek national character, particularly. Greeks have it, and perhaps to the surprise of many Greeks, it's alive and kicking right here in the United Kingdom.
In your book, you consider the Greek Revolution as a turning point in the affairs of Europe and the geopolitical map. How serious is nowadays the tension between the two sides of the debt, χρέος? The one side of Ianos, let's say, is the economic material debt of Greece to them, to the Europeans. And the other side of Ianos is the moral debt of Europeans to Greek civilization.
Yes, the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley in 1821 wrote that we are all Greeks. And he went on, our laws, our literature, and so on, our politics, they all owe their origin to ancient Greek civilization. And Shelley was one of many Europeans who argued at that time that since the civilization, the culture that we, whoever we are broadly trying to create in modern Europe owes such a debt to classical Greece that surely, therefore, we moderns also owe a debt to, as Shelley put it, the descendants of that glorious nation who, and he writes rather wonderfully, you know, I forget exactly how he put it, but whose existence our imaginations can scarcely comprehend as belonging to humanity. Shelley, like many Philhellenes, had a very exaggerated, idealized version of what ancient Greeks could possibly have been like in ancient times. But this idea that the debt is, there is a cultural debt from modern Europe to ancient Greece, it's never gone away. It was rather tellingly brought back to life in a book by a young American classicist, Johanna Hanning. Some of you may know that book. It's called The Classical Debt, and it's really a critique of the decade of austerity. And I think it's particularly important that it's written by a classical scholar, and she highlights really that conundrum, if you like, or that contradiction, that modern Europe owes a debt, or the modern world owes a debt to the Greeks as heirs of classical Greece. At the same time, the Greek state owes, even after the end of the immediate debt crisis, has constantly owed huge cash sums to foreign creditors, and most recently to the European institutions. Realistically, I think it's an asymmetrical debt for one thing. It's not even in the same currency, but they're both too big ever to be realistically repaid. That's probably about the most that we can say on it. But I would also like to quote, some of you may possibly have seen this, as part of the Greek embassy in London had a series of very short video interviews on the 25th of March, and I took part in this, where we all spoke for about a minute on the 200th anniversary. And the writer, comedian, personality, a very well-known name in the UK at any rate, Stephen Fry, said very succinctly, Greece will never owe to the rest of the world as much as the rest of the world owes to Greece. I think that's wonderful. I wish I'd thought of it, but credit to Stephen Fry. It sums up that asymmetrical, unpayable, mutual debt.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting discussion. But before closing this meeting, I would like to share with you a thought. I have noticed that you finish your book by mentioning two poets, Byron and Shelley, as if they were a kind of prophets. They were looking far into the future, you say. So, could you agree that poetry is revolutionary in its very essence and through its impact, and that the revolution of 1821 was poetic in a sense?
Well, on the last point, absolutely. But let me end in that case by quoting something else that Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote at exactly that time. He said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
Yes, of course. So let's close this meeting poetically. That's the best way. Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this discussion, and thank you all for your questions and for giving me the chance to elaborate on these matters that are very dear to my heart. Thank you.